David pulled into the parking lot of his downtown bank branch and turned off the engine. He sat there for a moment, looking at the building he had built from nothing 15 years ago. The sign read Community First Bank in bold blue letters, and he felt the same pride he always did when seeing it. But today was different. Today he wasn't here as the owner and CEO. Today he was just another customer. He looked down at his clothes and smiled. Faded jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and old sneakers that had seen better days. His wife had laughed when she saw him getting dressed that morning. "You look like you're going to mow the lawn, not visit your bank," she had said. That was exactly the point. David had started these surprise visits 2 years ago after reading some troubling online reviews about his branches. Customers complained about being treated differently based on how they looked or dressed. Some said staff members made assumptions about their finances before even talking to them. Others mentioned feeling unwelcome or judged. These comments bothered him deeply because they went against everything he believed in. When he first opened Community First Bank, his mission was simple: treat every person who walks through the door with respect and kindness. He wanted his bank to be different from the big corporate banks that made people feel like just another number. He wanted customers to feel valued no matter if they were depositing $10 or $10,000. But as the bank grew from 1 branch to 12, David realized he couldn't be everywhere at once. He hired managers he trusted and created policies that promoted fair treatment for all customers. Still, those negative reviews kept coming. That's when he decided to see for himself what was really happening when the boss wasn't around. His first undercover visit had been eye-opening. He watched as his staff treated well-dressed customers with smiles and quick service, while others had to wait longer or answer more questions. It wasn't always intentional, but the pattern was clear. Some customers got the red carpet treatment while others got barely polite service. Today's visit was to the downtown branch, one of his busiest locations. He had been putting it off because the branch manager, Robert, had been with him since the early days. Robert was someone David considered a friend, not just an employee. But recent reviews specifically mentioned this branch, and David knew he had to see what was happening. He got out of his car and walked toward the entrance, noticing how the building looked from a customer's perspective. The windows were clean, the landscaping was neat, and the welcome sign by the door looked inviting. Everything seemed perfect on the outside, but David knew that what mattered most was what happened inside. As he approached the automatic doors, he saw his reflection and barely recognized himself. Without his usual business suit and confident stride, he looked like any other person running errands on a Saturday morning. His hair was a bit messy, he hadn't shaved that morning, and his casual clothes made him blend in with the crowd. Perfect. The doors slid open and David stepped inside. The lobby was busy with the usual weekend rush. Families were opening savings accounts for their children. Young couples were discussing mortgage options, and elderly customers were making their weekly deposits. He loved seeing this kind of activity. It meant his bank was serving the community the way he had always hoped. He looked around at his employees, most of whom he had hired personally. There was Jennifer at the customer service desk, helping a woman with a stack of paperwork. Jennifer had been with the bank for 3 years and had always impressed him with her knowledge and professionalism during their staff meetings. At the teller windows, he saw Carlos and Lisa handling the morning rush with efficiency. Both were relatively new, but had come highly recommended. Behind the glass wall of the main office, he could see Robert on the phone, probably handling some important business matter. Robert had been his first hire when he opened the second branch. He was smart, dedicated, and had helped David expand the bank's services over the years. David trusted him completely, which made today's visit feel a bit like spying on a friend. Standing in the lobby, David realized he felt nervous. This was his bank, his business, his life's work. Yet here he was, worried about how his own employees would treat him. It was a strange feeling, being an outsider in a place he had created. He joined the line for customer service, standing behind a young mother with a toddler in her arms. The child was fussy and the mother looked tired, but Jennifer was patient and kind with them, even offering the little boy a sticker from her desk. This made David smile. This was exactly the kind of service he wanted to see. As he waited, David listened to the conversations around him. A teenage girl was opening her first checking account with her father's help. An elderly man was asking about the best savings options for his retirement money. A small business owner was discussing a loan for expanding her restaurant. These were the stories that made his work meaningful. These were the people his bank was supposed to serve. But David also noticed other things. He saw how some customers got immediate attention while others waited longer. He watched as staff members' attitudes seemed to change based on who they were helping. A man in an expensive suit was escorted directly to an office, while a woman in work clothes was told to wait in line. These subtle differences might not seem like much, but David knew they mattered. Finally, it was his turn. Jennifer looked up at him with a polite but distant smile. There was no recognition in her eyes, which was exactly what David had hoped for. To her, he was just another customer in casual clothes who might or might not be worth her time. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" she asked. Her tone was professional but not particularly warm. David took a deep breath. This was it. Time to see how his bank really treated its customers when the owner wasn't watching. Time to find out if all his policies and training actually meant anything when put to the test. Time to discover whether Community First Bank was living up to its name or just another place where people were judged by their appearance. "I'd like to talk to someone about opening a business account," he said. Simply. Jennifer's expression changed slightly, and David could almost see the wheels turning in her head as she looked him up and down, making quick judgments about his ability to handle a business account. This reaction told him everything he needed to know about what was coming next. Jennifer's smile became forced as she looked David up and down again. Her eyes lingered on his faded jeans and worn sneakers before returning to his face. The warmth she had shown the previous customer seemed to disappear instantly. "A business account," she repeated slowly, as if the words didn't quite make sense coming from him. "I see. And what type of business are we talking about, sir?" David had prepared for this question. He had done these visits before and knew that his employees would ask about his business. "I run a consulting company," he said calmly. "I help small businesses improve their operations." Jennifer nodded, but her expression remained skeptical. "Consulting? That's interesting." She paused, tapping her pen against her desk. "You know, business accounts require significant minimum deposits. Are you familiar with our requirements?" The way she asked the question made it clear she didn't think he was. David noticed how different her tone was compared to when she had helped the previous customer. With the well-dressed man who had come before him, she had been enthusiastic and helpful. With David, she seemed to be looking for reasons to discourage him. "I'd like to hear about the different options you offer," David replied, keeping his voice patient and polite. Jennifer sighed slightly, as if this conversation was already taking too much of her time. "Well, our basic business account requires a minimum deposit of $5,000. Our premium account, which I assume wouldn't be suitable for your type of business, requires $25,000. David raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think the premium account wouldn't be suitable?" "Oh, well." Jennifer stumbled slightly, realizing she might have overstepped. "I just meant that most consulting businesses, especially newer ones, usually start with our basic package." "Unless you have significant capital already?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. David could feel other customers in line behind him growing impatient, but he was learning valuable information about how his bank operated when he wasn't around. "I'd like to hear about the premium account," he said simply. Jennifer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She clearly didn't want to waste time explaining premium services to someone she had already decided couldn't afford them. "Sir, the premium account comes with features that are really designed for established businesses with substantial cash flow. The fees alone might not make sense for a smaller operation." David noticed how she kept emphasizing words like substantial and established, making it clear she didn't think his business qualified. What bothered him most was that she hadn't asked a single question about his actual business or financial situation. She was making assumptions based entirely on his appearance. "What kind of documentation would I need?" David asked, genuinely curious about the process his customers went through. "Extensive documentation," Jennifer said, her voice taking on a more official tone. "We need business licenses, tax returns for the past 3 years, profit and loss statements, bank statements from your current accounts, and references from other financial institutions. We also run credit checks on all business owners." She rattled off the list as if it was designed to overwhelm him. David knew these requirements because he had helped create them, but the way Jennifer presented them made it sound like an impossible mountain to climb. We also need to verify the legitimacy of the business, she continued. There are a lot of people who claim to run consulting companies when they're really just looking for ways to avoid paying taxes or hide income. David felt his jaw clench at this comment. She was basically accusing him of being a fraud without knowing anything about him or his business. This was exactly the kind of treatment that had generated those negative reviews. I understand you need to verify everything, David said, working hard to keep his voice level. That sounds reasonable. What would be the next step? Jennifer looked frustrated that he wasn't backing down. She glanced over at Robert's office as if hoping her manager would rescue her from this conversation. When she looked back at David, her expression had hardened even more. Look, sir, I'm trying to save you some time here. Opening a business account is a complex process that can take weeks. You'll need to make multiple appointments, bring in all that documentation, and there's no guarantee your application will be approved. Maybe you should consider starting with a personal checking account and seeing how that goes first. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. His own employee was actively trying to discourage a potential customer from opening an account. She wasn't asking about his needs or trying to find solutions. She was looking for ways to get him to leave. I appreciate your concern, David said, but I'd really like to speak with a manager about the business account options. Jennifer's eyes flashed with annoyance. Sir, I am qualified to handle business accounts. I've been doing this for 3 years. If you don't trust my expertise, maybe this isn't the right bank for you. The comment stung because David knew how much training and support he had provided to all his employees. Jennifer had attended dozens of workshops and seminars, all paid for by the bank. She had received bonuses for excellent customer service. Yet here she was treating a potential customer with barely concealed hostility. I'm not questioning your expertise, David said carefully. I just like to speak with management for major financial decisions. I'm sure you understand. Jennifer let out a small huff of frustration. Fine. Let me see if Robert is available. She picked up her phone and dialed the extension for Robert's office. David could hear her side of the conversation. Robert, I have a customer here who wants to talk about a business account, but he's insisting on speaking with management. She paused, listening. No, I've explained everything, but he won't take my word for it. Another pause. Okay, fine. She hung up the phone and turned back to David with a tight smile. Robert will see you, but he's very busy today. You'll need to wait. David nodded and took a seat in the waiting area. From there, he could observe the rest of the lobby and see how other customers were being treated. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. A young couple in designer clothes were immediately escorted to a private office when they mentioned wanting to discuss investment options. An elderly woman in a simple dress waited 20 minutes to cash a check, while tellers seemed to find urgent tasks to handle instead. A teenager trying to open his first savings account was told he needed to come back with his parents. Even though David knew bank policy allowed minors to open accounts with proper identification, the patterns were clear and disturbing. His employees were making snap judgments about customers based on their appearance, age, and perceived wealth. The warm, welcoming environment he had tried to create existed only for certain types of people. After 15 minutes, Robert emerged from his office. David watched as his old friend approached, wondering if Robert would recognize him. They had worked together for over a decade, but David looked very different in his casual clothes. Robert walked right past him without a second glance and spoke to Jennifer. Where's the customer who wanted to see me? Jennifer pointed directly at David. That's him, sitting right there. Robert turned and looked at David, and for a moment David thought he saw a flicker of recognition in his friend's eyes. But then Robert's expression settled into the same polite but distant professionalism that Jennifer had shown. Sir, I understand you wanted to speak with me about a business account. David stood up and extended his hand. Yes, thank you for taking the time to see me. Robert shook his hand briefly, and David could tell that his manager was already forming the same negative impressions that Jennifer had. The day was about to get even more interesting. Robert led David to a small conference room near the back of the branch. As they walked, David noticed how his manager's body language had changed from their usual friendly interactions. There was no smile, no casual conversation, just pure business formality. It was like watching a completely different person. Please have a seat, Robert said, gesturing to a chair across from his. He pulled out a notepad and pen, preparing to take notes. Jennifer mentioned you're interested in opening a business account with us. That's right, David replied, settling into the chair. The room felt cold and impersonal, nothing like the warm environment he had tried to create throughout his bank. "Before we get started, I need to ask you some questions about your business," Robert continued, his tone professional but distant. "What type of consulting do you do exactly?" David had prepared a simple story that would be believable. "I help small businesses streamline their operations and improve efficiency. Things like inventory management, employee scheduling, customer service improvements." Robert nodded and wrote something down. "How long have you been in business?" "About 5 years," David answered. "And what's your annual revenue?" David paused, knowing this was where things might get tricky. "Last year was around 400,000. Robert's pen stopped moving and he looked up sharply. "$400,000? His tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Yes," David confirmed calmly. "I see," Robert said slowly, clearly skeptical. "And you're looking to open an account with us because?" The question caught David off guard. In all his years of banking, he had never heard anyone ask a potential customer why they wanted to open an account. It was like asking someone why they wanted to breathe. "I'm expanding my business and need better banking services," David explained. "I heard good things about Community First Bank." Robert leaned back in his chair, studying David carefully. "Mr. He paused, realizing he didn't have David's name. "Johnson," David said, giving the first name that came to mind. "Mr. Johnson, I have to be honest with you. Claims of 400,000 in annual revenue are serious matters. We'll need extensive documentation to verify those numbers. Tax returns, profit and loss statements, business licenses, the works." David nodded. "I understand. What other information would you need?" "Well, we'd need to see bank statements from your current accounts for the past 2 years. We'd need references from other financial institutions. We'd need to verify your business address and see evidence of actual business operations." Robert was making it sound like applying for a business account was similar to applying for a top-secret government clearance. David knew the actual requirements were much simpler than what Robert was describing. "We also have to be very careful about money laundering," Robert continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "There are a lot of people who claim to run consulting businesses as a way to hide illegitimate income. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but we have to be cautious." There it was again, the subtle accusation that David might be a criminal. First, Jennifer had implied he was a tax evader. Now Robert was suggesting he might be laundering money. These were serious accusations to make about a potential customer based on nothing more than his appearance. "I completely understand your need to verify everything," David said, keeping his voice steady despite his growing anger. "What would be the timeline for this process?" "Weeks, possibly months," Robert replied. "And even then, there's no guarantee your application would be approved. We have very strict standards here at Community First Bank." David almost laughed at the irony. Robert was explaining the bank's high standards to the man who had created those standards. But what struck him most was how Robert was using those standards as weapons to discourage customers rather than tools to help them. "Maybe we should start with something simpler," Robert suggested. "A basic checking account, perhaps. Much less paperwork, much faster approval." It was the same suggestion Jennifer had made. Try to push the customer toward the least profitable service possible. David was beginning to see a pattern in how his employees dealt with customers they didn't think were worth their time. "I really am interested in the business account," David insisted. "Could I speak with someone else who might have more experience with these applications?" Robert's expression darkened. "Mr. Johnson, I've been managing this branch for over 10 years. I've handled hundreds of business accounts. If you don't trust my expertise, maybe you should consider banking somewhere else." The comment hit David like a slap. Robert, who owed his career to David's faith in him, was now suggesting that David take his business elsewhere. It was a level of arrogance and customer hostility that David never would have imagined from his old friend. "I'm not questioning your expertise," David said carefully. "I just like to be thorough when making important financial decisions." "Look," Robert said, leaning forward with obvious impatience, "I'm going to be straight with you. Your story doesn't add up. A consulting business making $400,000 a year, and you're dressed like you're going to work in your garage. Most of our successful business customers dress professionally when they come in to discuss their finances." David felt his face flush with anger. "Are you saying I can't bank here because of how I'm dressed?" "I'm not saying that," Robert backtracked quickly, realizing he might have gone too far. "I'm just saying that things don't quite match up. In my experience, when customers make claims they can't back up, It usually leads to problems down the road. Before David could respond, Robert stood up abruptly. You know what? I think this conversation has gone far enough. Jennifer can help you with a basic checking account if you're interested. Otherwise, I think you might be happier at a different bank. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. His own branch manager was essentially asking him to leave. Not only was Robert refusing to provide the service David had requested, he was actively encouraging him to take his business elsewhere. Are you asking me to leave? David asked directly. Robert hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direct question. I'm suggesting that maybe Community First Bank isn't the right fit for your needs. Based on what? The fact that I'm wearing jeans? Based on the fact that you're making claims about your business that seem questionable, and you're being argumentative with my staff, Robert replied, his voice becoming firmer. David stood up slowly. I haven't been argumentative. I've simply asked questions about your services and requested to speak with management. Isn't that what customers are supposed to do? Mr. Johnson, I think this conversation is over, Robert said, moving toward the door. If you'd like to open a basic checking account, Jennifer can help you. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. As they walked back into the main lobby, David noticed that other customers and employees were starting to pay attention to their conversation. Robert's voice had been getting louder, and people were beginning to stare. Jennifer looked up from her desk with a satisfied expression, as if she had been proven right about David all along. The security guard, who had been reading a magazine near the entrance, was now standing at attention, clearly alerted by Robert's tone. David realized that in just 30 minutes, he had gone from being a potential customer to being treated like a threat, all because he had dressed casually and asked reasonable questions about banking services. If this was how his employees treated him, he could only imagine how they treated other customers who didn't fit their narrow definition of worthy. The situation was about to get much worse before it got better. The lobby had grown uncomfortably quiet as David and Robert emerged from the conference room. Several customers had stopped their conversations to watch what was happening, sensing the tension in the air. David could feel dozens of eyes on him as Robert made it clear that their meeting was over. Tom, could you come over here, please? Robert called to the security guard, his voice carrying across the lobby. Tom Rodriguez looked up from his post near the entrance and began walking toward them. David had hired Tom 3 years ago after the man had served 2 tours overseas and was struggling to find work. Tom was a good person who took his job seriously, but David could see the confusion in his eyes as he approached. Is there a problem, Mr. Chen? Tom asked, looking between Robert and David. Mr. Johnson here was asking about business accounts, but I don't think we're going to be able to help him today, Robert explained, his tone making it clear that David was no longer welcome. Jennifer had stopped pretending to work and was watching the scene unfold with obvious satisfaction. Other employees had also paused their tasks, and David could see some of them whispering to each other behind their computer screens. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises, Robert said formally, as if he was following some official protocol. David looked around the lobby at all the faces staring at him. He saw curiosity, judgment, and in some cases, sympathy. An elderly woman near the teller windows was shaking her head disapprovingly at how he was being treated. A young father was pulling his children closer as if David might be dangerous. This was it. This was the moment David had been dreading but knew was necessary. He had seen enough. His employees weren't just providing poor customer service. They were actively discriminating against people based on their appearance and making assumptions about their worthiness as customers. Before I leave, David said calmly, reaching into his back pocket. I think there's something you should see. Robert stepped back slightly, unsure of what David might be reaching for. Tom moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. David pulled out his wallet and carefully removed a business card. It was simple and elegant, with the Community First Bank logo at the top. He handed it to Robert with a steady hand. Robert took the card and glanced at it casually, expecting to see some consulting company information. Instead, his eyes went wide as he read the text. David Mitchell, Chief Executive Officer, Community First Bank. The color drained from Robert's face as he looked up at David, then back down at the card, then up at David again. His mouth opened, but no words came out. What does it say? Jennifer called from her desk, unable to see the card from where she sat. Robert's hand was shaking as he held the business card. It says he's the CEO. The lobby erupted in whispers and gasps. Jennifer shot up from her chair and rushed over, snatching the card from Robert's trembling fingers. When she saw David's name and title, her face went completely white. "That's impossible," she whispered, looking at the card as if it might be a fake. David reached into his wallet again and pulled out his driver's license, holding it up so both Robert and Jennifer could see his name clearly. Then he pointed to the large portrait hanging on the wall, behind the teller windows, a professional photograph of him in a business suit that every employee saw, dozens of times each day. The silence in the lobby was deafening. Tom stood frozen, realizing he had been called over to escort his own boss out of the building. Other employees began gathering around, their faces showing various stages of shock, horror, and disbelief. "Mr. Mitchell," Robert finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I mean, you look so different." "I look different because I'm dressed like a regular person instead of wearing a suit," David replied, his voice calm but firm. "I came here today to see how my employees treat customers when they think no one important is watching." Jennifer was staring at the business card in her hands as if it might burst into flames. "Sir, I'm so sorry." "If I had known who you were." "If you had known who I was, you would have treated me differently," David interrupted. "But what about all the other customers who aren't the CEO? Don't they deserve the same respect and courtesy?" Robert was frantically trying to think of something to say that might salvage the situation. Mr. Mitchell, this was all just a misunderstanding. We were just being cautious." "Cautious about what?" David asked. "About a customer who was politely asking about your services? About someone who wanted to open a business account and bring money into this bank." The other customers in the lobby were watching this scene unfold with fascination. Some were taking out their phones to record what was happening. David noticed an elderly man nodding approvingly, as if he had experienced similar treatment himself. "Jennifer, in the past 30 minutes, you've suggested that I might be a tax evader, and that I should go to a check cashing store instead of banking here." David continued, his voice growing stronger. "Robert, you've accused me of money laundering and told me to take my business elsewhere. All because I'm wearing jeans and a t-shirt." Tom was still standing nearby, looking absolutely mortified. David turned to him with a gentler expression. "Tom, I want you to know that you didn't do anything wrong. You were just following orders from your manager. But I hope this situation helps you understand why it's important to question those orders when they don't seem right." Tom nodded gratefully, relief washing over his face. David looked around the lobby at his employees and customers. "I started this bank 15 years ago with a simple mission: to treat every person who walks through these doors with dignity and respect. I wanted Community First Bank to be different from the big corporate banks that judge people by their appearance or their account balance." Jennifer was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she realized the magnitude of what had happened. Robert looked like he might be sick. "I've been doing these undercover visits for 2 years because I kept getting complaints about discriminatory treatment," David continued. "I hoped those complaints were isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Unfortunately, what I experienced today proves that the problems are much worse than I thought." A woman near the customer service desk raised her hand tentatively. "Excuse me, sir, but I want you to know that this kind of thing happens here a lot. I've seen other customers treated badly if they don't look wealthy enough." Other customers began nodding and murmuring in agreement. David realized that this moment had given people permission to speak up about experiences they had been keeping to themselves. "Thank you for telling me that," David said to the woman, "and I want everyone here to know that this behavior is completely unacceptable and against everything this bank stands for." He turned back to Robert and Jennifer, who were both standing there looking like they wanted the floor to swallow them up. "We'll be having a very serious conversation about this in my office on Monday morning," David said firmly. "Right now, I want both of you to think about whether you can honestly say you've been treating all of our customers the way they deserve to be treated." The lobby was buzzing with conversation as customers discussed what they had just witnessed. Some were expressing support for David's actions, while others were sharing their own stories of poor treatment at various banks. David looked around at the scene and realized that this moment, as uncomfortable as it was, might be exactly what his bank needed. Sometimes the only way to fix a problem is to expose it completely, no matter how painful that exposure might be. The weekend following David's shocking revelation at the downtown branch felt like the longest of his life. He spent Saturday evening at his kitchen table, going through every complaint and negative review his bank had received over the past 2 years. His wife, Linda, brought him coffee and sat beside him as he read through story after story of customers who had felt judged, dismissed, or unwelcome. "Listen to this one," David said, reading from his laptop screen. "A woman says she was made to feel embarrassed for trying to open a savings account with $50. The teller asked her 3 times if she was sure she could maintain the minimum balance." Linda shook her head sadly. "How did it get this bad without you knowing?" "I thought I was building the right culture," David replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "I thought having good policies and training would be enough. But I was so focused on growing the business that I lost sight of what was happening on the ground level." Sunday was spent calling each of his 12 branch managers for emergency meetings. David didn't tell them what had happened at the downtown branch, but he made it clear that major changes were coming. Some managers sounded nervous, others confused, but all of them agreed to meet first thing Monday morning. Monday arrived gray and rainy, matching David's mood as he drove to the bank's main office. He had scheduled Robert and Jennifer to meet with him at 9 o'clock, an hour before the staff meeting with all the managers. Robert arrived 10 minutes early, looking like he hadn't slept all weekend. Jennifer came in right at 9, her eyes red from crying. David had known both of these people for years, had celebrated their promotions and personal milestones, had considered them part of his extended family. That made what he had to do even harder. "I want to start by saying that what happened Friday was not just about you two," David began, sitting across from them in his office. "It was about a culture that I allowed to develop in my bank, a culture where some customers are valued more than others." Robert cleared his throat nervously. "David, I've been thinking all weekend about what happened. I know there's no excuse for how we treated you, but what?" David asked. "But I honestly didn't think we were doing anything wrong," Robert admitted. "We get so many people who come in making big claims about their businesses, and most of them can't back it up. I thought we were protecting the bank." David leaned back in his chair. "Protecting the bank from what? From customers who want to give us their money?" Jennifer spoke up for the first time. "We see a lot of people who waste our time, people who ask about services they can't afford, people who don't have the proper documentation, people who don't look like you think they should look?" David interrupted. The question hung in the air. Jennifer looked down at her hands, unable to meet David's eyes. "Here's what's going to happen," David continued. "Jennifer, your employment with Community First Bank is terminated effective immediately. Your actions on Friday showed a level of prejudice and unprofessionalism that I cannot overlook." Jennifer started crying again, but she didn't argue. She had known this was coming. "Robert, your situation is more complicated," David said, turning to his old friend. "You've been with me for over 10 years. You've helped build this bank, but you've also failed in your most important job, which was creating an environment where all customers feel welcome." Robert's face was pale, but he nodded. "I understand if you need to let me go too." "I'm not firing you," David said. "But you're being demoted from branch manager to assistant manager. You'll spend the next 6 months working directly with customers under close supervision. If you can prove that you've learned from this experience, we'll discuss your future with the company." After Robert and Jennifer left, David spent an hour preparing for the most important meeting of his career. At 10 o'clock, all 12 branch managers filed into the conference room, their faces showing various levels of curiosity and concern. David started by telling them exactly what had happened on Friday. He described every detail of his experience, from Jennifer's initial dismissive attitude to Robert's suggestion that he take his business elsewhere. The room was completely silent as he spoke. "This is not an isolated incident," David continued when he finished his story. "I've been reading customer complaints for 2 years, and I've been seeing the same patterns over and over. Some of our customers are being treated like valued clients, while others are being treated like potential criminals." Branch manager Carol Williams raised her hand tentatively. "What do you want us to do differently?" "I want you to remember why we're here," David replied. "We're not here to judge people based on their clothes or their car or their accent. We're here to provide banking services to everyone in our community who needs them. Over the next 3 hours, David outlined a comprehensive plan to change the culture at Community First Bank. Every employee would go through mandatory training on unconscious bias and inclusive customer service. Mystery shoppers would visit each branch regularly to evaluate customer treatment. A new customer feedback system would make it easier for people to report problems. Most importantly, employee performance reviews would include specific measures of how well they served all customers, not just the profitable ones. "I know some of you are thinking that this is all unnecessary," David said as the meeting wound down. "You're thinking that what happened on Friday was an isolated incident that won't happen again. But I need you to understand that every time we make a customer feel unwelcome or unworthy, we're failing at our most basic mission." The changes began immediately. David spent the next week visiting every branch, talking to employees and observing customer interactions. He was encouraged by what he saw in some locations, but troubled by problems at others. It was clear that the issues at the downtown branch were not unique. 2 weeks later, David received a phone call that made all the difficult changes worthwhile. It was from Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had been treated poorly at one of his branches 6 months earlier. "Mr. Mitchell, I heard about what you did at your downtown branch," she said. "I wanted to tell you that I went back to the branch where I had problems, and it was like a completely different place. The young man who helped me was so kind and patient. He didn't make me feel stupid for asking questions." David smiled as he listened to her story. "I'm so glad to hear that, Mrs. Rodriguez. That's exactly what we're trying to achieve. You know," she continued, "I had moved all my money to another bank because of how I was treated. But now I'm thinking about coming back to Community First. If you're really committed to treating all customers right, then maybe this old lady should give you another chance." That phone call was followed by dozens of others. Customers who had left the bank began returning. Online reviews started improving. Local newspapers wrote articles about the bank's commitment to inclusive service. Most importantly, David began seeing the kind of interactions in his branches that he had always envisioned. 3 months after the incident, David made another unannounced visit to the downtown branch. This time he wore his usual business suit, but he watched carefully as other customers were served. He saw a teenage girl opening her first savings account with $20, and the teller was just as excited and helpful as if she were depositing $20,000. He watched an elderly man in work clothes get the same respectful treatment as a woman in an expensive dress. Tom, the security guard, approached him with a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell. It's nice to see you here." "It's nice to be here," David replied, looking around the lobby. "How are things going?" "Much better, sir. The new training has really helped everyone understand how important it is to treat every customer well, and I have to say the atmosphere is so much more positive now." David nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. The incident that had started as his worst nightmare had become the catalyst for the most important changes his bank had ever made. As he left the branch that day, David reflected on the lessons he had learned. Building a successful business wasn't just about profits and growth. It was about creating an environment where every person who walked through the door felt valued and respected, regardless of how they looked or how much money they had. The sign outside still read Community First Bank, but now David knew that his employees truly understood what those words meant.